Of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. David Padgett, and the issue is environmental injustice, dealing with the environmental justice movement. And Dr. Padgett, since we are dealing with this as our final segment, let's have you to sort of, over the last 8 or 10 minutes, to sort of wrap up some of the things that you could believe that our audience ought to be familiar with or ought to know concerning this movement, as well as some of the issues involved in the movement. Okay,
yeah. As I mentioned before, the Bordeaux landfill had to deal with waste, and also the Dixon County case and the Sheila Holt family, that deals with waste again. And so waste is a problem that exists here nationally. We have a very wasteful society, and in fact, we're so wasteful that we export waste all over the world. And lead acid batteries from our automobiles end up in Southeast Asia, in India. Then they're taken apart and mined for lead by sometimes children who are exposed to those toxins, or just poor people all over the world exposed to our leftovers from the automotive industry. A lot of our what's called tech waste, that's a big thing now. A lot of computers and a lot of components in computers actually have lead, gold, silver, and other precious metals that are mined after we ship these products as waste overseas. After our computers become obsolete very quickly, we just send boatloads full of this material to Africa, India, poor countries where, again, poor people are engaged in a very dangerous and hazardous recycling process. And that is seen as an environmental injustice, because anytime that we have waste as a product of our activities, that's an environmental problem. And so low-income and poor people all over the world are being exposed to our toxic waste. There have been some United Nations agreements and conventions to try to prevent that from happening, but it's very difficult to regulate and almost impossible to enforce. Looking at the global issues further, the issue of global warming is something that we might think of as being not a racial issue, but scientists are seeing now that those who are going to be disproportionately impacted by global warming are people of color. We can look at perhaps a domestic example with Hurricane Katrina. We now know, climatologists now know, that there is a definite relationship between global warming and hurricanes. And in fact, Hurricane Katrina, Rita, and Wilma that struck during that 2005 season were some of the most massive, powerful hurricanes we've ever recorded. And that is a direct result of the waters being warmed up by this global warming phenomenon. And so right here, New Orleans, global warming due to hurricanes. If we look abroad, anytime we have global warming, there's going to be increased drought, which means increased crop failure, which means famine and disease in parts of the world that can ill afford to have their crops fail. They already have food and water shortages, and so global warming results in many cases in severe drought or more extreme droughts in Africa especially, and in places where you have marginal rainfall. And so global warming and its disproportionate impacts upon people of color is an environmental justice issue that is being recognized. And there are actually researchers, some at Howard University, climatologists, that are working on ways to predict the advent of drought cycles so that perhaps we can act proactively to famine instead of reactively in some of these places of the world. And also the energy crisis is a global crisis that is impacting people of color disproportionately, in that we're now turning more to nuclear energy and oil, of course, and we've turned Africa more as a place where we get our oil. And in fact, a lot of us were alarmed at the Gulf oil spill, but those types of spills occur in Nigeria all the time. Maybe not to that magnitude, but close to it. And people in Nigeria and in the Niger River Delta live right next to a lot of the pipelines and the oil refinery facilities. It's even worse than what's happening in Cancer Alley in Louisiana. But we don't even hear about it. And yet, because of our thirst for oil, collectively, we are more dependent upon Nigeria, Gabon, and other places in Africa to exploit those resources. As uranium becomes more and more valuable, as we're trying to turn away from petroleum resources, specifically because of what happened in the Gulf, and the environmental security and all the problems associated with oil, we're turning more towards uranium. Africa is becoming a greater and greater source of uranium, which is a very nasty, dangerous, and hazardous mining process. And so we have a lot of African countries that are dealing with the waste. Uranium mining creates massive amounts of waste, toxic piles of waste right next to villages. Water, contaminated water leaking into people's homes and around, and people have to live around this stuff. And in many cases, another variable in the environmental injustice is when people have to choose between making money and having a clean environment. So a lot of African nations are saying, well, this uranium is going to bring us some money, but then at what cost? We're going to give up our health, we're going to give up our clean environments for this uranium. And that's a very difficult place for people to be in. And in fact, one of the worst but less well-known cases of environmental injustice in Africa is the mining of something called coltan. Coltan is a mineral without which you would not have the cell phone industry or these PlayStations. Almost all of those technical tools run off of this coltan mineral. 80% of the coltan supply in the world is found in Central Africa, mined by people who make less than $40 a month.
Who couldn't even afford a cell phone.
Multi-billion-dollar industry that creates a lot of pollution, a lot of hazards. It's just another means of environmental exploitation of Africa, with African people not gaining any of that wealth. I mean, you've heard of blood diamonds. Well, you have blood diamonds, we have blood uranium. You may as well say we have blood cell phones and blood PlayStations. Even some of the timber resources from Africa are being pillaged. So we even have blood timber. And so the result of this is that as Africa becomes much more of a source of natural resources and raw goods, especially oil and uranium, now we see a greater intervention of the U.S. military in Africa through what's called the African Command. And so now we have a much greater intervention, military, U.S. military in sub-Saharan Africa, especially under the guise of fighting against terrorism. You know, we've heard that before, but actually it's another move to put in place a secure force in order to extract these products. And it's basically the same thing that happened in Iraq, whereas now we know that after this long conflict, the military is moving out of Iraq and oil companies are moving into Iraq. And so the same thing now is happening in Africa. And again, the byproducts of oil and energy resource exploitation and strategic mineral exploitation is people are being exposed to all kinds
suffering of the people. In other words, all over Africa. And well, what about Pakistan? You know, the recent floods in Pakistan. What impact do you think that'll have?
Well, that again is, you know, lack of access to resources to mitigate these types of things. And some of the solutions that have been put forth in Haiti, in fact, in Africa, there's a Dr. Wangari Maathai, who was the first African woman to win a Nobel Peace Prize. She actually used environmental remediation as a means to bring peace to Kenya. And we see the Greenleaf movement in Haiti is another movement, an environmental-based movement, which says if we improve the earth and our surroundings, then we can bring peace. And I think that's a global movement that's largely built upon small grassroots organizations all over the world that is bringing a solution to some of these environmental injustices globally.
Very good. And of course, Dr. Padgett, let me thank you for all of that information and tell you how much we appreciate that, because no matter what we say, people are still suffering, and we certainly don't want to encourage that, and I think that you're doing everything that you can to keep that from happening. And let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and